Welcome to another edition of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum where all voices matter. The controversy over vaccine availability and the lack of progress for domestic vaccine production within Canada rumbles on. Even after the approval of Canadian vaccine production for up to 2 years from now, and Albertan and Manitoban moves to purchase locally, there are still a lot of unanswered questions. Rejoining me to discuss is Elliot Hughes. He's a senior advisor at Summa Strategies Canada. Welcome back, Elliot.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, what's your take on the state of vaccine production here in Canada?
Well, the state of vaccine production here in Canada, obviously we're a little bit behind the eight ball. The government has made some investments that will pay off in several months, if not years. Which is great. But frankly, that gets us ready for the next crisis and the next vaccine production that we need. But today, we're focused, with this vaccine nationalism, the sort of geopolitics of vaccination. And because of this lack of production and, the facilities here in Canada, we find ourselves waiting and hoping and relying on our good relationships with countries from around the world to be able to procure those vaccines. Now, that's been slow to date, but it will be speeding up significantly in the coming weeks and months.
Now, one of the, issues several months ago was around the planned work that was going to be together between Canada and China. And that fell through. Is that one of the reasons why we're in the state we're in?
It's perhaps one of the reasons. I think that would have been one of those vaccines that would have probably come on board later on this year, early next year. Don't quite know for sure, but obviously anything when it comes to relationships with China right now are challenging. But this problem isn't something that is new of a couple months ago or last year. This is something that, started 50 years ago, where Canada used to be a world-leading vaccine manufacturer and producer and distributor. And that changed in the 90s, where there was a decision by the federal government, in the 80s, I should say, the federal government at the time, to privatize some of those companies. And that's not to say that subsequent governments haven't made some poor decisions in this space either, but this is something that should frankly be past partisanship and not partisan, and something that we as a country need to be thinking about more in terms of what's good for all of Canada and Canadians. And what we're learning now is what can we do today to anticipate and make sure that we don't find ourselves in a similar problem in 5, 10, 15 years from now when another vaccine problem comes up or another pandemic comes on us, and we have to fight back. What are the things that we can learn from where we are today to avoid being in the same situation in the future?
Yeah, I think you're right, because we were having this debate, let's say just under a year ago, over supply chains for PPE. And the point was made, we need more domestic supply chain for that. And basically the same can be said for vaccine production, right?
Absolutely. What are some of those big areas, those big ideas, those key sectors that frankly Canada needs to be self-reliant in? Where we can't rely on our goodwill with European countries or Americans to the south. But just ones that we just need to be in control of. I think vaccine production and distribution falls firmly in that bucket. I would suggest there are a couple other ones that we can talk about now or later. One that comes to mind is, cybersecurity. Mm-hmm. We know cybersecurity is going to be a problem. It's already a problem today. At some point, all the experts are saying that there's going to be a huge cybersecurity breach in the future, and it's going to potentially cripple our government. That's going to have tremendous impacts. What are the things that we can do today? What are the investments that the federal government, in working with the provinces, can make today to ensure that we do our best to avoid something like that? I think climate change is another space as well. But again, what are these things what are the lessons that we're going to learn from the challenges that we've seen from the COVID pandemic, and not necessarily just in global health, but in other policy areas as well? What are those lessons that we can take away and put into place in the coming years, as an entire country, frankly?
We're going to continue our discussion with Elliot Hughes. He's the Senior Advisor at Summa Strategies Canada about vaccine production and development and other things as well. Please stay with us after the break. Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Elliot Hughes. He's a Senior Advisor at Summa Strategies Canada, talking about vaccine production and other topics. And I'm going to kind of blend the two right now, Elliot, because you have been outspoken recently about one of the indicia of this vaccine production imbroglio being a lack of entrepreneurial spirit. So why don't you expand on that a little bit?
Well, the point I was trying to make at the time was in the UK, the woman in charge of the vaccination production and distribution in that country was someone who came from the innovation and tech space. It wasn't your typical, perhaps, procurement expert. It was someone who had a little bit more innovation experience, let's say. And was willing to take some risks. You see now where that's put the UK. They're in a fantastic position. I believe 1 in 4 or 1 in 5 citizens have received the vaccine, which is great. Now, of course, there are trade-offs to that. In Israel, for example, who's also doing quite well in terms of getting people vaccinated. From what I understand, they made some deals with some pharmaceutical companies to give up some public health data on their citizens. Right. So. This idea of entrepreneurship, this idea of risk-taking, Canada sometimes feels as though we're not leaning into some of these challenges as much as we could. We are perhaps a little bit too afraid to fail and just try things to see how they work. And Americans are typically good at this as well. And there's that spirit down there. And that kind of spirit would have been, and I think is important for us to cultivate and to try and grow a little bit more in Canada. Obviously with some guardrails in place as well. We can't just allow people to go sort of wild in the Wild West and there's no rules and let's just see how things work out. But I do think generally, whether it's individuals or the government, with a little bit more a willingness to take risks and a little bit more of that entrepreneurship, we might find ourselves in this situation being able to procure vaccines a little bit quicker, and it may be able to apply itself to other policy areas as well.
So you see it as an entrepreneurial deficit, not only in the business sector, but in the ranks of government then?
I don't quite want to say that, entrepreneurs don't exist in Canada, because we do have a lot of entrepreneurs. We in that entrepreneurial spirit does exist. I think what Canada does very well, and why we're such a fortunate country, is in a sense, the government has been small c conservative in its approach in some things and doesn't take big risks. And with that comes some security, which is nice. But the flip side to that is perhaps there's less excitement and there's less reaching for the stars, so to speak, in Canada, both in government and in the private sector. So I don't necessarily want to say that we're pitting against the private versus public sector. I don't think that's where I want to go with this. I think what I was trying to say and what I'm saying now is, if there's a bit more of a willingness to allow people to go out and try things, and we provide that support with the right kind of guardrails in place, perhaps we might find ourselves a little bit, one of the leading countries when it comes to innovation.
I will say this about Israel and their deal with, I believe it is Pfizer. You mentioned the health data that is being collected. I mean, that really is a gift to the world, because they're such a diverse population, and the health data will help animate the vaccine choices and the medicine around vaccines for the rest of the world. Is that a fair thing to say?
I think that's certainly an opinion. I think the flip side could be, would Canadians be comfortable sharing their personal health data with pharmaceutical companies? Mm-hmm. I don't know what the answer to that question is. I'd like to believe at least some people may have a few questions to ask before that is done. But certainly there are some benefits to that, but there are some negatives. And so these are the types of trade-offs that I think we need to be able to and should be embracing to explore, in a sense, to be able to sort of have that public conversation of what are we willing to give up, what are we willing to trade in order to perhaps have innovation flourish, perhaps get that vaccine sooner. What are Canadians' feelings on this, and is this an approach that we want to pursue?
We're going to continue our discussion with Elliot Hughes. He's the Senior Advisor at Summa Strategies. We're talking vaccine production and development, as well as innovation in Canada. Stay with us until after the break. We'll be right back. And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with Elliot Hughes. We're talking about vaccine production and generally the state of infrastructure in Canada when it comes to innovation and production. Elliot, you mentioned before the break the UK. Of course, they've now jabbed well over 15 million people with at least one. I think over 500,000 have had both. And that certainly dwarfs Canada's record and many other countries around the world. So what, based on your knowledge and understanding, what is the UK model and how much of that could be applied to Canada in the future?
From what I've gathered, the UK was willing to entice companies to set up production facilities in their country. I think they also had production facilities in the UK already. And so right there, Canada is at a little bit of a disadvantage. I will say, though, I mean, Canada did do some good things. I mean, there are some challenges with what we've done so far, but the government has done some good things. I mean, we spent over $1 billion, getting over, close to 450 million doses from 7 of the different leading vaccines, promising vaccines. So that's good. We've spent close to $300 million on production facilities that sure aren't going to come on for a little while now, but that will come on in the months and in the years to come. And so we have taken some good steps. Again, the challenge comes back to, a question that, was posed a number of decades ago is, should we be, creating these vaccines and have the facilities here in Canada? And then the next step is, are we able to manufacture them and distribute them? So there's 2 questions there. The government of the day decided, no, this is not something that the government of Canada should be responsible for. I think we're finding now that perhaps we need to have that conversation. We need to have that debate. Is the government, should they be responsible around vaccines? Should the private sector play a role, or is this something the government should be in charge of? So I think with the UK, they had a built-in advantage. I think they were a little bit more adventurous in tempting companies to come set up and produce in the UK, whether that's tax breaks, or helping with building of the facilities. But they were able to build off of a built-in advantage that we just didn't have in Canada, which is why we find ourselves relying on other countries to send us their vaccines.
Yeah, it's pretty frustrating. I must say, as a former federal and provincial health minister, one of the things I did was obviously get the first national pandemic plan going. And one of the aspects of that was that we were to have a contract with a local supplier for influenza pandemic vaccine production. And in fact, we did do that with GlaxoSmithKline. It was renewed in 2011, 10-year contract. Now that was influenza, which is obviously different from what we're dealing with. But that's the kind of thing you need, is people to think ahead and have those conversations with the WHO and with the vaccine producers. That's the kind of thing we need to have in the future.
You're right. And I would imagine that you probably didn't get a lot of political plaudits for that kind of move, because it doesn't necessarily play in the cut and thrust of day-to-day politics. But frankly, it's exactly what a federal government should be thinking about, should be worrying about, and should be doing. I think the current government has been doing this in some areas, but can be a little bit better in thinking about that. And I come back to an earlier point that I made. on cybersecurity, or maybe it's agri-food, agriculture and agri-food. Is that a sector that we want to focus on and invest in, where the payback may not come next month or during the election campaign, whenever that comes, but down the road. And it's those smart investments that position Canada as a great place to live, a great place to set up a business and invest. And those are the types of things that the federal government, in my opinion, should be concerning itself with and should be focused on.
Do you think it's clear now to everybody the long-term positive impacts of local domestic vaccine production?
I think so. I think the idea that we would have been able to get things produced and distributed, manufactured all at home and become an exporter of vaccines is very appetizing to Canadians. And it's something that I think people now realize is important. But what I would urge us to think about is, so we've learned that lesson. How can we apply those lessons to other policy areas? That thinking, that long-term approach, those smart investments, what are those other policy areas that we can invest in now? We know a lot of the solutions are already out there. It's just about getting the money directed to the places that are going to make the biggest impact down the road.
Welcome back to Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, having a conversation with Elliot Hughes. He's a senior advisor at Summa Strategies Canada. Before we pivot to some other areas, Elliot, I'd love to get your perspective. I know you were an insider in government, so I'm asking you to put your analyst hat on that and not give away any secrets, but I'd love to get a sense, and my viewers love to get a sense of what's happening within the halls of government, what's going on inside as they deal with these vaccine shortages and the way forward. What do you think the conversations are like there?
Well, they've probably been pretty tough in the last few weeks because of the production and the receiving vaccines here in Canada, and frankly a shortfall of where the government had wanted it to be. Now I think you are starting to hear a change in the tone and the communications from the Prime Minister on down, including the Minister of Procurement, whereby it's now very much going to turn to, okay, the federal government has now taken its heat. It's now turning to the provinces to be ready. You've had a break here, unfortunate break, but a break to be able to get your storage facilities ready, to test your distribution methods, to get staff trained up and ready to be able to hit the numbers that we need to hit, because those vaccines are coming in and they're going to be coming in hundreds of thousands a week. The Pfizer vaccine, I think, is going to be close to 11 million doses by June, along with some of the other vaccines as well. So the messaging at the federal government, they've really taken a licking in the last couple of weeks. I think that's going to start to turn, and the focus and the pressure, frankly, is going to be much more on the provincial governments as those vaccines land and as people demand that those vaccines get into the arms.
Well, something that is no doubt going to be occurring very soon. So let's pivot to your other point, major point, which was that this is a broader discussion than just vaccine production. It's about making sure that our local supply chains are what they should be, manufacturing is what it should be. Any final thoughts on that?
Well, I think it's interesting, too, the idea of vaccine nationalism, the geopolitics at play here, too. Russia and China have also established vaccines for COVID-19. Right. There is, frankly, I think some real anger in developing countries at developed countries putting themselves at the front of the queue, in front of everybody else. And frankly, China and Russia have acknowledged and see this and are beginning to engage with countries such as Rwanda, such as South Africa, providing them with vaccines that those folks are going to remember who helped them out when times were really tough. If Canada had been in a position where we were producing our own vaccines, we would have been able to take a leadership role in reaching out and helping those developing countries and providing them with vaccines, obviously in concert with making sure that Canadians have been taken care of. So that sort of, domestic production actually could have had an international and geopolitical benefit. But now we find ourselves in the position of, imagine you're one of these countries who has now been pushed to the back of the line, and you're turning to other countries like China and Russia, and you see Canada and the US
and India
taking care of themselves.
And India too.
And India as well. Imagine how you would feel if you were in their position. So it's not just an inability to vaccinate our own citizens here in Canada, this lack of domestic production, but there's actually this geopolitical international component where I think we're losing out to some of our largest competitors in Russia and China, and that's not good for vaccines, and it's not good for broader political issues on the international front either.
Well, in the developing world, as I was mentioning, India is also becoming a mass exporter and will be making sure a vaccine is available to a lot of countries. I guess from a geopolitical perspective, that at least blunts the sharp instrument that is China and Russia. And Canada itself might be a recipient of Indian largesse. So interesting topic. I'm afraid we're out of time right now, Elliot, but thank you for being part of our program. Would love to have you back in the future.
Thanks very much.
Thank you. Lots going on when it comes to vaccine production and development, not only in Canada, but throughout the world. Obviously a topic of primary importance to Canadians. We'll keep on top of it here at the News Forum.